Lincoln, Slavery, and the Civil War, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I spent most of my time laying out two things. One being Lincoln's general policy of containment and ultimate extinction. That's how he thought the problem of slavery should be approached. And I contrasted that with Stephen Douglas's articulation of the pop-sov approach, the idea that slavery should not be a national issue, that each state under the Constitution has the right to determine for itself whether to allow or to abolish slavery. And so I talked about that. Now, I wanted to lay out the other part of Douglas's position before we move on to Lincoln, and that is Douglas's agreement with Chief Justice Taney that the founders, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, were only talking about white men, not about the whole human race. So when the signers of the Declaration say all men are created equal, they meant by that not actually all men, but only all white men. And he lays this out, his account of it, on page 158 of your packet. Now, just a few sentences from the earlier paragraphs, right? He says, I hold it that it is a violation of the fundamental principles of this government to throw the weight of federal power into the scale, either in favor of the free or in favor of the slave states. Equality among all states of this union is a fundamental principle in our political system. And you go down to the next paragraph. It says, I say to you that there is but one hope, one safety for this country, and that is to stand immovably by that principle which declares the right of each state and each territory to decide these questions for themselves. Right, so that's popular sovereignty. Then he goes on in the last paragraph on page 158 to lay out, basically his interpretation that America was founded on the principle of white supremacy. It says, but the Abolition Party really think that under the Declaration of Independence, the Negro is equal to the white man, and that Negro equality is an inalienable right conferred by the Almighty, and hence that all human laws in violation of it are null and void. With such men, it is no use for me to argue, Douglas says. I hold that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to Negroes at all when they declared all men to be created equal. They did not mean Negro, nor the savage Indians, nor the Fiji Islanders, nor any other barbarous race. They were speaking of white men. They alluded to men of European birth and European descent, to white men, and to none other when they declared that doctrine. I hold that this government was established on the white basis. It was established by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and should be administered by white men and none others. Right, so there you can't get a more blatant statement of white supremacy than that. The founders created the United States as a white man's country, and even the Declaration should be understood to include only whites. Now, nonetheless, Douglas, he's not a Confederate. Douglas is not like Calhoun. He's not actually an ideological proponent of slavery. And that's why he goes on to say the following. But it does not follow by any means that merely because the Negro is not a citizen, right, just as Dred Scott had said, and merely because he is not our equal, that therefore he should be a slave. Right, that's Calhoun's view. African Americans should be slaves. Douglas is saying they shouldn't be citizens, they shouldn't be treated as social equals, but that doesn't mean that they should be slaves. As he says, on the contrary, it does follow that we ought to extend to the Negro race and to all other dependent races all the rights, all the privileges, and all the immunities which they can exercise consistently with the safety of society. So they should be granted some freedom. Humanity requires that we should give them all these privileges. Christianity commands that we should extend those privileges to them. The question then arises, what are those privileges and what is the nature and extent of them? So in other words, he's saying that African Americans shouldn't be slaves or shouldn't necessarily be enslaved. The question is, what is the degree of freedom that they should be allowed? And this is where he falls back on Pop Sov again, and we run into the quotation that I read to you last time. So the question then arises, what are those privileges which should be given to African Americans, and what is the nature and extent of them? My answer is that that is a question which each state must answer for itself. We in Illinois have decided it for ourselves. We tried slavery, kept it up for 12 years, and finding that it was not profitable, we abolished it for that reason and became a free state. We adopted in its stead the policy that a Negro in this state shall not be a slave, no slavery, and shall not be a citizen, not have full rights of citizenship or civil rights. So in other words, African Americans were sort of like resident aliens. We have a right to adopt that policy. For my part, I think it is a wise and sound policy for us. You in Missouri must judge for yourselves whether it is a wise policy for you. If you choose to follow our example, very good. If you reject it, still well. It's your business, not ours. So with Kentucky, let Kentucky adopt a policy to suit herself, and so on and so forth. So fall back on Pop Sov. So in other words, his argument is, and what this really comes down to then is he's saying the status of African Americans should be determined by the white population of each state. Right? So he doesn't say that the only proper position for African Americans is slavery, but he does basically say that it is up to whites to determine what the status of non-whites have. They have no inherent right to a particular status. And this leads to a kind of unstated premise, or it reveals an unstated premise in Douglas's arguments that Lincoln really hammers on, right? Which is that Douglas's position, let each state decide for itself, is morally coherent only if you do not think that slavery is inherently wrong. Right? So in other words, if it's indifferent, if you could take it or leave it, then it makes sense to say, leave it up to each state to decide, right? It doesn't matter. They could choose to adopt a policy or not. It doesn't matter. You think of something like some countries have the metric system. Some countries have the imperial system like us with inches and things like that. And I mean, there's nothing morally at stake in choosing between the metric system and the imperial system. It could go either way. So let each country decide for itself. What does it matter? It's not inherently wrong to choose one or the other. And so basically what as Lincoln goes on to say, that the way that Douglas approaches the issue of slavery is one that implies that there's nothing inherently wrong with it. You might say, sort of by analogy, sort of like for people who have a pro-choice position on the question of abortion, the pro-choice position is basically to say, leave it up to each woman to decide whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. And that is a morally coherent position if you do not think that, at least within certain limits, the termination of a pregnancy is inherently morally wrong, right? If you don't see it as equivalent to murder or what have you. But obviously, if something is inherently wrong, if, say, slavery is inherently wrong or abortion is inherently wrong, then there's something kind of morally incoherent about saying, let each person decide for themselves. Because that's basically saying, let them decide for themselves whether they commit an evil act. Normally we only think that options are valid when each choice is sort of morally okay. So this is just a way of saying that where Lincoln really hammers on Popsov is the fact that it refuses to take a stand on whether slavery is wrong or not, and in fact implicitly rests on the claim that there's nothing wrong with slavery. Thus, if states want to have it, they can have it. So here's how the selection I gave you from Lincoln on page 159 begins. I have stated upon former occasions, and I may as well state again, what I understand to be the real issue in this controversy between Judge Douglas and myself. On the point of my wanting to make war between the free and slave states, there has been no issue between us. So too, when he assumes that I am in favor of introducing a perfect social and political equality between the white and the black races. These are false issues, upon which Judge Douglas has tried to force the controversy. There is no foundation in truth for the charge that I maintain either of these propositions. The real issue in this controversy, the one pressing upon every mind, is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as a wrong, and of another class that does not look upon it as a wrong. So in other words, the real issue, the real sort of dividing point is some people believe that slavery is wrong and other people do not. As he says, the sentiment that contemplates the institution of slavery in this country as a wrong, morally wrong, is the sentiment of the Republican Party. Right? So the Republican Party adopts the position that slavery is fundamentally, inherently, morally wrong. They look upon it as being a moral, social, and political wrong. And while they contemplate it as such, they nevertheless have due regard for its actual existence among us and the difficulties of getting rid of it in any satisfactory way, and to all the constitutional obligations thrown about it. So in other words, this is why the Republican Party is not the abolitionist party. They're not saying we should need to abolish slavery immediately. They're saying, on the one hand, slavery is morally wrong, full stop. On the other hand, slavery is here in parts of the country. And it is a very difficult question to figure out the best way or the least bad way of getting rid of it. And we recognize that the Constitution creates certain protections for slavery, the Fugitive Slave Clause, for example. Right, and the federal government doesn't have the power to force states to abolish slavery, right? It's not given that power. So it is the case, really, as Douglas said, that the Constitution does leave it up to each state to decide whether to have slavery or not. So there are constitutional protections for this existing institution, and it's hard to know how to figure out how to abolish it. And in that sense, you could say that the Republican position on slavery isn't that different from the position of many of the founders, as we talked about before. It's a morally evil institution, but it is already here, and it is difficult to figure out the best way to get rid of it. So nonetheless, the Republicans believe that slavery is wrong. And so as he goes on to say, yet, having due regard for these difficulties and protections, having due regard for these, they desire a policy in regard to slavery that looks to its not creating any more danger. Right, so slavery is here, but let's not make it worse. They, Republicans, insist that it should, as far as may be treated as a wrong. That is, even if slavery is protected, we still, in our policy, in our approach towards slavery should be rooted in the fundamental sort of premise that this is an evil institution. We must treat it as a wrong. And as he goes on to say, and one of the methods of treating it as a wrong is to make provision that it shall grow no larger. So this is Lincoln's policy of containment. Slavery exists. It is protected where it exists by the Constitution. So how does one approach the question of slavery given the fact that this evil institution is nonetheless protected? Well, a basic kind of no-brainer is fine. Let's at least not let it spread even further, right? Don't make the problem worse by letting slavery spread even further. If it's bad, contain it. It says they also desire a policy that looks to a peaceful end of slavery at some time as being wrong. So, in other words, contain it, don't let it grow bigger, and try to find a peaceful way to abolish it over time. That's the Republican position, according to Lincoln, and that's Lincoln's position. And what he says is that's the true morally consistent way or to approach it. I mean, basically, Lincoln's kind of laying out there's sort of two morally consistent ways of approaching slavery. One, acknowledge it as an evil and therefore contain it and try to abolish it over time. Or two, you go kind of full Calhoun and argue, no, it's not evil, it's a positive good. Right? Those two positions are coherent because they're based on either saying slavery is bad and therefore ought to be abolished eventually, or slavery is just fine and therefore should be protected. And what he basically says is Douglas he tries to split the difference with Popsov. He tries to remain neutral on the issue of slavery by saying, let each state decide for itself. But that neutrality is ultimately morally untenable, as he says about 2/3 of the way down, page 161. He says about Douglas, he says he don't care whether it is voted up or voted down in the territories, right? The institution of slavery. I do not care myself in dealing with that expression, whether it is intended to be expressive of his individual sentiments on the subject, which is that he really doesn't care, or only of the national policy that he desires to have established. It is alike valuable for my purpose. Any man can say that who does not see a wrong in it. Any man can say that who does not see anything wrong in slavery. Right? If you say, I don't care, they can have it or not. If there's nothing wrong in it, that makes sense. But no man can logically say it who does see a wrong in it. Because no man can logically say he don't care whether a wrong is voted up or voted down. He may say he don't care whether an indifferent thing is voted up or voted down. But he must logically have a choice between a right thing and a wrong thing. He contends that whatever community wants slaves has a right to have them. So they have, if it is not a wrong. But if it is a wrong, he cannot say people have a right to do wrong. I mean, that just makes sense, right? If you think slavery is wrong, you treat it as such. Right? But if you say, I don't care, let each state decide for itself, what you're really saying is there's nothing wrong with slavery. It's not inherently wrong. But as you know, Lincoln is committed to the position, which he believes, I think rightly, is to be found in the Declaration of Independence and in the founding of our country, which is that every human being has a natural right to be free, an equal natural right to be free. And if that is true, then slavery is wrong. You can't be indifferent to it. So that's Lincoln's approach. That's why he also says, and this will be the last thing for this lecture, that's why he says in his first inaugural on page 164 of your packet, near the middle, one section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. Right, this is really where you have to start with the fundamental first principles. Right? And the starting point for dealing with the question of slavery, you have to begin with the moral question. Is slavery morally legitimate or not? You have to answer that question before you can make any further steps in terms of thinking about what particular policies should be towards it. You have to begin with moral clarity. And the problem with Popsov is, well, it's really two things. One, it tries to avoid taking a moral stand in an issue where you really must take a moral stand. And on the other hand, by allowing states to choose to adopt slavery, you are allowing for an evil institution to grow and spread. And that's what Lincoln is against. There will be one more lecture where I talk a little bit more about Lincoln.